At my wife's sister's wedding, my wife's sister introduced me to her boss as an unemployed loser. Her boss looked at me, smiled, and said to the bride, "You're fired. My name is Marcus Hale, and if you're expecting some sob story about how hard my life is, you're going to be disappointed. I've got a beautiful wife named Tessa, a house with good bones, and enough money in the bank to sleep easy at night. What I don't have, apparently, is the kind of job that impresses 20-something tech bros at wedding rehearsal dinners. But we'll get to that in a minute." The Harbor House was doing its best impression of class that Friday night. All dimmed Edison bulbs and exposed brick, the kind of place that charges $47 for what they call artisanal mac and cheese, but is really just pasta with fancy cheese. The private dining room was packed with my wife's family and a bunch of Bianca's work friends who looked like they'd stepped out of a LinkedIn ad. You know the type. Fresh haircuts, expensive watches they probably financed, and that particular brand of confidence that comes from having never been truly humbled by life. Bianca Ortiz, soon to be Bianca Reyes, poor bastard Jordan, is my sister-in-law, and tonight was her big moment to shine before the wedding tomorrow. She's 26, sharp as a tack, and has been climbing the corporate ladder at some tech investment firm in Chicago like her life depends on it. Which, knowing Bianca, it probably does. The girl's got more ambition than a real housewife at a charity auction, and about as much subtlety. I was sitting there, minding my own business and working on what had to be the world's most overpriced Caesar salad, when Bianca's voice cut through the dinner conversation like a buzzsaw through plywood. She'd had enough champagne to float a small yacht, and her filter had officially left the building. "So, Adrian," she was saying to this silver-haired guy who looked like he'd been born wearing a suit, "I absolutely love working at Luminate Ventures. I mean, the energy there is just incredible. We're growing so fast, and you always say you only respect winners, right?" She flashed this megawatt smile that probably cost her parents a fortune in orthodontist bills. Adrian Wolf, because of course his last name is Wolf, nodded politely. He was her boss, apparently, and had the kind of face that gave away absolutely nothing. Corporate poker face perfected over decades of telling people their dreams were stupid while somehow making it sound like a compliment. But Bianca wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting warmed up. She turned toward me with this look that I'd seen before. The same expression my neighbor's cat gets when it's about to knock something expensive off a shelf just because it can. Unlike some people at this table who don't even have a job. The room went quieter than a church on Monday morning. Margaret, my mother-in-law, suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. Clive, the father-in-law, cleared his throat like he was trying to dislodge a golf ball. Jordan, the poor groom-to-be, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear until this whole marriage thing blew over. I felt Tessa's hand find mine under the table, giving it a little squeeze that said both, "I'm sorry," and "Please don't murder my sister at her rehearsal dinner." Smart woman, my wife. She knows me well enough to recognize when I'm calculating exactly how many different ways I could destroy someone's entire world before dessert arrives. The thing is, everyone at that table thought they knew my story. Unemployed Marcus, the deadbeat brother-in-law who married up and now spends his days doing God knows what while his successful wife pays the bills. I could practically hear their thoughts. Poor Tessa, stuck with that loser. At least Bianca's got her act together. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, except maybe Tessa, and even she didn't know the full extent, was that I had my fingers in more pies than a bakery owner with commitment issues. See, I like my home office. I like my garden. I like my peace and quiet and the ability to work in sweatpants if I damn well please. But that doesn't mean I'm sitting around eating bonbons and watching soap operas all day. I smiled at Bianca, the kind of smile you give a toddler who just announced they can fly. "You're absolutely right," I said, cutting another piece of lettuce. "I don't have a traditional job." She looked so pleased with herself, like she'd just solved world hunger or figured out how to make airline food edible. Her work friends chuckled, that uncomfortable kind of laughter people do when they're not sure if they should be laughing, but everyone else is doing it, so they might as well join in. Marcus is very creative with his time, Margaret offered weakly, bless her heart. She was trying to smooth things over, but it was like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. "Oh, I'm sure he keeps busy," Bianca said, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sweetness that could rot your teeth from across the room. "We all need our hobbies, right?" Hobbies. That's what she called it. I took another bite of my $40 rabbit food and nodded thoughtfully. Absolutely. Everyone needs something to keep them occupied. Adrian was watching this whole exchange with the intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse, but he stayed quiet. Smart man. In situations like this, it's usually better to let people dig their own graves rather than hand them the shovel. The conversation moved on to wedding details and work gossip, but I could feel the damage hanging in the air like smoke after a grease fire. Bianca had made her point loud and clear in front of her boss, her colleagues, and both our families. Marcus Hale was a loser, a disappointment, someone to be pitted rather than respected. I kept eating my salad and listening to the chatter, watching as Bianca basked in what she thought was her moment of triumph. She'd established the pecking order, put me in my place, and shown everyone exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of successful people. What she didn't realize was that she'd just started a clock ticking. See, I've learned something over the years. People reveal who they really are when they think you can't touch them. When they believe you're beneath them, that's when they show you their true colors. And Bianca had just painted herself in shades I wouldn't use to decorate a gas station bathroom. I finished my salad, complimented the bride on her choice of venue for tomorrow, and made small talk about the weather with Uncle Frank, who'd driven down from Milwaukee and had strong opinions about the Cubs' chances this season. All normal, all pleasant, all perfectly civilized. But inside, I was setting a timer. Because sometimes, the best response to being underestimated isn't to prove people wrong immediately. Sometimes, it's better to let them keep digging until they've made a hole so deep they can't climb out of it. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day. The drive home from Harbor House was quieter than a morgue at midnight. Tessa kept glancing at me from the passenger seat like I was a bomb that might go off if she hit the wrong pothole. She knows me well enough to recognize when I'm in what she calls my dangerously calm mode. That special state where I get so pissed off that I actually become more polite and reasonable, which somehow makes me 10 times scarier than if I just started yelling like a normal person. "You okay?" she finally asked as we pulled into our driveway, which was about as loaded a question as asking someone if they've stopped beating their wife. "Peachy," I said, and I meant it. I was better than okay. I was energized in the way that only comes from watching someone hand you exactly the ammunition you need to completely destroy their world. It's like Christmas morning, but instead of presents under the tree, you've got a perfectly wrapped opportunity for justice. Tessa went upstairs to do whatever mysterious nighttime ritual women do that involves 17 different skincare products and at least 45 minutes in the bathroom. I told her I needed to check some emails, which wasn't exactly a lie. It's just that the emails I needed to check weren't the kind most people would expect from someone who supposedly spends his days watching Netflix and scratching his ass. My study is my sanctuary, a room that Tessa lovingly calls my man cave, and I prefer to think of as my command center. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a desk that's older than most of the tech bros who probably make more in a year than my grandfather made in a decade. It's the kind of room where serious business gets done, even if that business is conducted by a guy in cargo shorts and a Cubs t-shirt. I flicked on the lights and there it was, hanging on the wall like a trophy from a hunting trip I'd never bothered to brag about. The original Luminate Ventures term sheet from 6 years ago, complete with my initials in blue ink right next to Adrian Wolf's signature. Right below that, a stack of early pitch decks bound in leather, each one representing a meeting where I'd asked hard questions and written bigger checks than most people see in their retirement accounts. And there, in a simple black frame that cost about $12 at Target, was a photo of Adrian and me from the year Luminate launched. We're both younger, both hungrier, both standing in what used to be their first office, a converted warehouse space that smelled like stale coffee and desperate ambition. Adrian's got his arm around my shoulder, and we're both grinning like idiots who just figured out how to print money in the basement. We weren't best friends then, and we're not best friends now. But we respected each other, which in the business world is worth about 10 times more than friendship and lasts about 100 times longer. I'd backed him when he was just another MBA with a PowerPoint and a dream, when every other investor in Chicago thought venture capital was either too risky or too boring to bother with. The beautiful thing about that relationship was how quiet it was. My shares in Luminate were held through something called Hale Crest Holdings, a family investment vehicle that sounded exactly boring enough that nobody ever asked questions about it. No flashy press releases, no mentions in TechCrunch, no ego-stroking interviews about my vision for the future of innovation. Just paperwork, signatures, and the kind of steady returns that let me buy organic tomatoes without checking the price. I pulled out my leather notebook, the kind of old-school paper and pen setup that drives young people crazy because they can't figure out how to sync it to their phones. This particular notebook had been with me for 3 years, filled with observations, ideas, and the occasional reminder to pick up dry cleaning or call my mother on her birthday. Tonight, I was adding a new entry. I wrote down the date, June 14th, and then carefully transcribed Bianca's exact words from dinner. Unlike some people who don't even have a job. I noted the time, approximately 8:15 p.m., and the audience, her boss, several colleagues, both sets of parents, and about 20 other witnesses who'd remember this moment for very different reasons than they expected. Then I wrote down something else. The way she'd used status as a weapon, the casual cruelty of someone who'd confused job titles with human worth, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from believing you're untouchable because you work at a prestigious company. I also made note of tomorrow's wedding guest list, which Tessa had shared with me weeks ago when she was trying to figure out table assignments. Several Luminate partners would be attending. Elena Park, who sat on their board and had the kind of reputation that made grown CEOs break out in cold sweats. Priya Menon, who ran people and HR and could smell workplace drama from 3 time zones away. Kyle Durant, who handled investor relations and knew exactly which partners preferred their bad news delivered with coffee or bourbon. And Mira Voss, their strategy lead who could calculate the cost-benefit analysis of firing someone while simultaneously ordering catering for the company picnic. Perfect witnesses for what I was starting to think of as tomorrow's educational moment. The thing is, I wasn't planning revenge. Revenge is what angry people do when they want to hurt someone who hurt them. It's emotional, it's messy, and it usually backfires in spectacular ways that leave everyone worse off than when they started. No, what I was planning was much simpler and infinitely more effective. I was going to turn on the lights. See, most people live their lives in partial darkness, making assumptions about others based on incomplete information and surface-level observations. They see someone working from home and assume he's unemployed. They see someone who doesn't brag about his accomplishments and assume he doesn't have any. They confuse quiet confidence with weakness, humility with failure. Light has this amazing property. It shows you exactly what's been there all along. It doesn't create dust. It just makes visible the dust that was always floating around, invisible until someone flipped the switch. Bianca thought she knew who I was. Hell, most of my wife's family thought they knew who I was. The unemployed brother-in-law who'd married up and was coasting on his wife's success, probably counting the days until she came to her senses and traded up for someone with a real career and a LinkedIn profile worth bragging about. Tomorrow, they were going to learn that assumptions, like shadows, tend to disappear when you introduce enough light to the situation. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair, looking at that photo of Adrian and me. 6 years ago, we'd been 2 guys betting on the future of technology and each other. Now, one of us was running a successful venture capital firm, and the other was supposedly a deadbeat who couldn't hold down a job. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. I heard Tessa's footsteps on the stairs, which meant she'd finished her skincare routine and was probably wondering if I'd spent the last hour plotting someone's demise or just checking sports scores. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between. "Coming to bed?" she called from the hallway, her voice carrying that particular note of wifely patience that meant she'd already figured out I was up to something but had decided to pretend otherwise until morning. "Just finishing up?" I called back, closing the notebook and turning off the desk lamp. Tomorrow was going to be a very educational day for everyone involved. And the best part was, I wouldn't have to say a word. Saturday afternoon rolled around like a lazy cat in a sunbeam, all warm and peaceful, and completely oblivious to the chaos that was about to unfold in approximately 4 hours. I was out in the backyard, tending to my tomato plants. The Cherokee purples were coming along nicely, and the San Marzanos looked like they'd actually produce something edible this year instead of the sad, shriveled disappointments I'd harvested last season. Gardening is one of those activities that people either get or they don't. Some folks think it's boring as watching paint dry, while others find it meditative as hell. I'm firmly in the second camp. There's something deeply satisfying about coaxing life out of dirt, about the predictable rhythms of watering and weeding and waiting. Plants don't lie to you, don't backstab you at dinner parties, and don't judge you based on your job title or lack thereof. I was giving the tomatoes their afternoon drink when I heard the sliding door open behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Tessa. After 12 years of marriage, you develop a kind of spouse radar that can identify your partner's footsteps from 3 rooms away. What I could also sense, without looking, was that she had something on her mind. The way she walked across the patio had that particular deliberate quality that meant we were about to have what she calls a conversation, and what I call an interrogation disguised as casual chat. "Marcus," she said, settling onto the little wrought iron bench we bought at a garage sale 3 summers ago. Her voice had that carefully neutral tone that wives perfect somewhere around year 2 of marriage. The one that sounds relaxed but carries about 17 different subtexts underneath. "Hey, babe," I said, not turning around from my tomatoes. Sometimes it's easier to have important conversations when you're not making eye contact. Less pressure, more honest. "What's up? We need to talk about tonight." There it was. I'd been waiting for this conversation since we'd gotten home last night. Honestly surprised it had taken her this long to bring it up. Tessa's not usually one to let things simmer. She's more of a get it out in the open and deal with it type, which is one of the things I love about her. No games, no passive-aggressive hints, just straight talk from someone who's smart enough to see around corners. I finished watering the last plant and turned to face her. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, wearing that little sundress I'd bought her for her birthday, and the expression she gets when she's trying to figure out how to say something important without starting a fight. "Shoot," I said, settling down next to her on the bench that was definitely not designed for 2 full-grown adults, but somehow managed to hold us anyway. She took a breath, and I could practically see her organizing her thoughts. "Bianca was out of line last night. Way out of line. What she said was cruel and unnecessary, and I'm honestly embarrassed that she's my sister sometimes." She paused, looking out at the garden. "But Marcus, you had this look on your face when she said it. That scary calm look. And I know you well enough to know that look means you're planning something." Scary calm. That's what she called it. I preferred to think of it as strategic composure, but I guess tomato. "I'm not planning to cause a scene," I said, which was absolutely true. Scenes were messy, dramatic affairs that involved raised voices and public confrontations. What I had in mind was much more elegant than that. "But you are planning something," she pressed, "because my wife didn't get to where she is in life by accepting half answers and deflection." I considered how much to tell her. Tessa knew about my connection to Luminate. She'd been there when I'd first started working with Adrian, had listened to me debate the pros and cons of various investments over dinner for years. What she didn't know, because I'd never seen a reason to burden her with the details, was exactly how significant my stake in the company had become over time. "I'm planning to let Bianca see people instead of labels," I said finally. "Sometimes people need a little perspective adjustment, you know? A gentle reminder that the world doesn't actually revolve around their job title and annual salary." Tessa studied my face with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. "How gentle are we talking here?" "Gentle enough that no one gets hurt," I said. "Not so gentle that the lesson gets missed." She was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. Tessa's got one of those minds that can see 3 moves ahead in any conversation, which makes her dangerous at board games and invaluable in marriage negotiations. "Marcus," she said slowly, "I love my sister. I do. But I also love truth. And the truth is that Bianca has been getting away with being casually cruel to people for years because she's smart and successful, and our parents think that makes her behavior acceptable." She turned to look at me directly. "If someone needs to teach her that actions have consequences, I'd rather it be you than life itself. You'll be kinder about it." That was my wife, cutting straight to the heart of things with surgical precision. Most people would have spent 20 minutes dancing around the issue, trying to protect everyone's feelings and avoid conflict. Tessa just laid it out plain. Bianca needed to learn something, and better she learn it from family than from strangers who wouldn't care about collateral damage. "What if it gets ugly?" she asked. "What if she doesn't take the lesson well? Then I'll step in," I promised. "If things go sideways, if she gets genuinely hurt instead of just humbled, I'll make it right." But Tessa, she called me a loser in front of her boss, her colleagues, and both our families. She used my supposed failure as entertainment for her work friends. That's not just mean, it's stupid. And sometimes stupid needs consequences. Tessa nodded slowly. She'd been there last night, had seen the casual cruelty in her sister's voice, the way Bianca had turned my perceived weakness into her moment of superiority. You know what the worst part was? She said. It wasn't even true. You're not unemployed, you're not a loser, and you're sure as hell not a failure. But she said it anyway because she thought it would make her look better by comparison. People reveal who they are when they think you can't touch them, I said. Last night, Bianca showed everyone exactly who she is when she thinks someone is beneath her. And tonight, she gets to find out who I actually am. Tessa leaned against my shoulder, and I could feel some of the tension leave her body. Just promise me something, she said. Promise me that whatever you're planning, it comes from a place of wanting to teach her something, not from wanting to hurt her back. I promise, I said, and I meant it. Revenge was for people who wanted to cause pain. Education was for people who wanted to prevent it from happening again. We sat there for a while, watching the tomatoes grow and listening to the neighbor's dog bark at absolutely nothing, the way dogs do when they're bored and want to remind the world they exist. In a few hours, we'd be getting dressed for Bianca's wedding, putting on our fancy clothes and our public faces and pretending that last night never happened. But it had happened. And tonight, we were all going to learn something about the difference between assumptions and reality. I should go start getting ready, Tessa said eventually, standing up and brushing imaginary dirt off her dress. Yeah, I said. Big day ahead. She paused at the sliding door and looked back at me. Marcus, whatever happens tonight, I'm on your side. Just remember that she's still my sister. I won't forget, I said. And I wouldn't. Family was family, even when family needed to learn some hard truths about respect and humility. The tomatoes would be fine without me for one evening. Tonight, I had bigger things to tend to. The thing about preparing for battle, and make no mistake, tonight was going to be a battle, even if it looked like a wedding, is that every detail matters. From the shoes you wear to the way you hold your shoulders, everything sends a message. And I intended for my message to be loud and clear without saying a word, which is why I found myself standing in Armando's tailoring at 9:30 Saturday morning, surrounded by more fabric than a theater costume department, and feeling like I was suiting up for the most important performance of my life. Armando Gutierrez had been tailoring suits in Chicago for 37 years, and his shop looked like it hadn't changed since the Carter administration. Bolts of fabric lined the walls from floor to ceiling, creating a rainbow of grays, blues, and blacks that would make a funeral director weep with joy. The smell of steam and starch hung in the air like incense, and somewhere in the back, an ancient sewing machine hummed along like a mechanical prayer. Mr. Hale, Armando said, emerging from behind a rack of suits with his measuring tape draped around his neck like a stethoscope. He was a small man with careful hands and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The charcoal, yes? For tonight. I'd called him yesterday after the rehearsal dinner, which had probably seemed insane to anyone listening. Who the hell orders a custom suit alteration with 12 hours notice? But Armando understood that sometimes a man needed to look like exactly who he was, not who people thought he was. That's the one, I said, as he gestured for me to step up onto the fitting platform that had probably seen more Chicago power brokers than City Hall. The suit was beautiful in that understated way that costs more than most people's car payments, but never advertises the fact. Charcoal gray wool that felt like liquid mercury, cut in a classic style that wouldn't look out of place in a boardroom or at a state dinner. Not flashy, not trendy, just impeccably made and perfectly fitted to suggest that the man wearing it had his shit thoroughly together. Arms up, Armando instructed, sliding the jacket over my shoulders with the reverence of a priest handling communion wafers. His hands moved quickly, pinning and adjusting with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this dance thousands of times. You want to look like money without looking like you're trying to look like money, yes? Exactly, I said. The man understood the assignment. He stepped back, studying the hang of the jacket with the intensity of an art critic examining a Picasso. Dignity, he said, nodding once. Dignity is the cleanest line. Everything else is just showing off. While he worked his magic with pins and chalk, I thought about the psychology of clothing. Most people think fashion is shallow, all surface and no substance. But anyone who's ever walked into a room and felt underdressed knows better. Clothes are armor, communication, and confidence all rolled into one. Tonight, I needed to look like someone who belonged in the same conversation as venture capitalists and tech executives, not like someone who'd wandered in from the unemployment line. The shirt, Armando said, producing a crisp white cotton button-down that looked like it had been pressed by angels. Simple, clean, nothing fancy because fancy makes people think you're trying too hard. I nodded. The shirt was perfect, expensive enough to signal quality, simple enough to avoid looking desperate for attention. Paired with the charcoal suit, it would create exactly the impression I was going for. Quiet competence, understated success, the kind of man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone because his record spoke for itself. And the tie? He asked, holding up 3 options like a sommelier presenting wine choices. I considered the options. A bold navy with subtle pattern that screamed, "Look at me," a conservative gray that whispered, "I'm boring but reliable," and a brushed silver that suggested, "I'm interesting enough to notice, but not so flashy that you'll remember what I was wearing instead of what I said." "The silver," I said, "but not a regular tie clip. Something simple." Armando nodded approvingly and disappeared into the back room, returning with a slim platinum tie bar that caught the light without throwing it around like a disco ball. It was the kind of piece that whispered rather than shouted, elegant without being ostentatious. "Your wife gave you this?" he asked, and I realized I'd been unconsciously touching the tie bar. "3rd anniversary," I said. Tessa had surprised me with it after I'd closed a particularly difficult deal back when I was still playing the corporate game full-time. The inscription on the back was too small for anyone else to read, but I knew it was there, for my quiet storm. Good woman," Armando said, which was possibly the understatement of the century. By the time he finished with the alterations, I looked like a completely different person. Not flashier or more expensive, just more like myself, if that makes sense. Like someone had turned up the contrast on a photograph, making everything sharper and more defined. From Armando's, I drove across town to First National, where I'd been banking for 15 years and where everyone still called me Mr. Hale despite the fact that I told them 100 times to just call me Marcus. Old school banking, old school manners, and most importantly for today's purposes, old school discretion. Jonathan Pierce, my banker, was waiting for me in his office with the kind of certified check that most people only see in movies about lottery winners. $35,000, made out to Bianca Ortiz and Jordan Reyes, with wedding gift written in the memo line in Jonathan's careful handwriting. "Are you sure about the amount?" he asked, sliding the check across his desk like he was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. "Positive," I said. The amount was significant enough to make an impression without being so large that it looked like I was trying to buy my way out of trouble. It was generous, thoughtful, and completely unexpected from someone who supposedly couldn't afford to pay his own bills. Jonathan had been handling my finances long enough to know that 35 grand was pocket change for me, but he also knew that most people at a wedding wouldn't know that. To them, it would look like I'd probably cleaned out my savings account to give my sister-in-law a respectable wedding gift, which made it even more powerful as a statement. "Gift card message?" he asked. "Just best wishes for a beautiful future together," I said. Simple, classy, and completely free of any hint that this gift came with strings attached or lessons included. From the bank, I made one more stop, Elite Transportation, where I booked a car service to the Lakeshore Conservatory. I could have driven myself, but arriving in a professionally chauffeured car sent a different message than pulling up in my 5-year-old Honda. Tonight was about perceptions, and every detail mattered. The driver would pick me and Tessa up at 5:30, giving us plenty of time to arrive fashionably on time rather than anxiously early. I specified that I wanted their most understated vehicle, not the white stretch limo that screamed, "Look at me," but the black sedan that whispered, "I belong here." By 3 o'clock, everything was in place. The suit hung in my closet like a soldier's uniform ready for battle. The check sat in my jacket pocket like a loaded weapon. The car was booked, the timeline was set, and all that remained was waiting for the moment when the lights would come on and everyone would see exactly what had been hiding in the shadows. I went back to my study and pulled out the leather notebook one more time, adding a final entry. "Ready. Let there be light." Tonight, Bianca was going to learn that assumptions, like shadows, disappear when you introduce enough illumination to the situation. and I was going to enjoy every second of it. The Lakeshore Conservatory looked like something out of a fairy tale that had been given an unlimited budget and a really good interior designer. Glass walls stretched up toward a vaulted ceiling that seemed to go on forever, creating this cathedral of light that made everything inside glow like it had been touched by some kind of divine Instagram filter. Hanging gardens cascaded from every available surface, and the afternoon sun streaming through the glass turned the whole place into a greenhouse paradise that probably cost more per hour to rent than most people make in a month. I had to hand it to Bianca and Jordan. They'd picked a hell of a venue. The kind of place that made you want to get married again, just so you'd have an excuse to stand in all that natural beauty and pretend your love was as eternal as the architectural bones holding the whole thing together. Tessa and I arrived right on time, which in wedding terms meant we were fashionably punctual without being embarrassingly eager. The car service had been perfect, smooth, quiet, and exactly the right level of understated elegance. When we stepped out of that black sedan, I caught a few people glancing our way with the kind of mild curiosity reserved for guests who looked like they might be more important than initially expected. My suit felt like armor, and I moved through the gathering crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. The charcoal gray caught the light just right. The white shirt was crisp enough to cut glass, and the platinum tie bar that Tessa had given me 3 years ago caught the occasional ray of sunshine like a subtle beacon of quiet success. "You clean up nice," Tessa murmured as we walked toward the ceremony space, her arm linked through mine. She looked absolutely stunning in a navy dress that somehow managed to be elegant, appropriate, and jaw-droppingly beautiful all at the same time. After 12 years of marriage, she still had the power to make me forget whatever I was thinking about and just stare like a teenager with his first crush. "Not bad yourself," I said, which was possibly the understatement of the decade. The ceremony area was set up in the main conservatory space, with white chairs arranged in perfect rows facing a makeshift altar that had been decorated with enough flowers to stock a small florist shop. The guest list was exactly what you'd expect from a tech executive's wedding. A mix of family members trying to look comfortable in fancy clothes, work colleagues who'd clearly spent their Saturday afternoon getting expensive haircuts, and a handful of plus ones who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. I spotted the Luminate Ventures crew immediately. Adrian Wolf was easy to pick out, silver hair, perfect posture, and the kind of calm confidence that comes from making life-changing decisions before most people finish their morning coffee. Elena Park stood near the back, scanning the crowd with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people and situations as a survival skill. Priya Menon was chatting with what looked like other wedding guests, but I could tell she was cataloging everything she saw for future reference. Kyle Durant had that slightly uncomfortable look of someone who'd rather be reviewing quarterly reports than making small talk about centerpieces. Perfect witnesses for what was coming later. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, this was just a wedding, and despite everything that had happened at the rehearsal dinner, despite whatever was going to unfold during the reception, I had to admit that Bianca looked absolutely beautiful. She appeared at the back of the conservatory right on schedule, and I'll be damned if she didn't take my breath away. The dress was some kind of flowing ivory creation that looked like it had been designed by angels with excellent taste and unlimited budgets. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was flawless, and when she started down the aisle on Clive's arm, she looked like every bride should look on her wedding day, radiant, happy, and completely convinced that she was the center of the universe. I wasn't going to take that away from her. Whatever lessons needed to be learned could wait until after she'd had her moment in the spotlight. Wedding days were sacred, even when the bride happened to be someone who'd spent the previous evening using your supposed failures as entertainment for her work friends. Clive looked proud as hell walking his younger daughter down the aisle, and I caught Margaret dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that had probably cost more than most people's lunch. Family moments like this transcended whatever petty bullshit had happened at dinner parties or would happen at receptions. This was about love, commitment, and the hope that two people could build something beautiful together. The officiant was some friend of Jordan's who'd apparently gotten ordained online specifically for this occasion, which should have been tacky, but somehow worked perfectly in the conservatory setting. He kept the ceremony short and sweet, focusing on the couple rather than showing off his newly minted religious authority. Jordan looked nervous as hell but happy about it. the way grooms should look when they're about to promise their entire future to someone they're crazy about. When Bianca reached the altar and Clive placed her hand in Jordan's, the poor guy looked like he'd just won the lottery and was afraid someone was going to tell him it was all a mistake. The vows were sweet, if a little rehearsed. Bianca had clearly spent hours crafting something that sounded spontaneous while actually being perfectly polished, which was very her. Jordan went for sincerity over sophistication, stumbling slightly over his words, but making up for it with genuine emotion that had half the audience reaching for tissues. When they kissed, the conservatory erupted in applause and camera clicks, and for that moment, all the drama and tension from the night before seemed to evaporate like morning mist. This was what weddings were supposed to be about. Two people making promises to each other while surrounded by everyone who loved them. But then came the photo session, and that's when things started to get interesting again. Margaret went into full mother-of-the-bride mode, shepherding Bianca around the conservatory like a personal publicist working the red carpet at the Oscars. Every conversation was a networking opportunity. Every introduction was a chance to show off her successful daughter to an audience of colleagues and industry connections. "Elena, you simply must meet my daughter," I heard Margaret saying as she practically dragged Bianca toward the Luminate board member. Bianca's been such an asset to Adrian's team. I kept my distance, chatting with the florist about the hydrangeas and watching the social dynamics play out like some kind of corporate theater performance. Bianca was in her element, working the crowd with the skill of someone who'd learned early that success was as much about who you knew as what you knew. She introduced herself to investors, charmed the plus ones, and generally held court like a queen receiving tribute from her subjects. Every conversation reinforced her position as the successful sister, the one who'd made something of herself, the family member everyone could be proud of. And through it all, I watched and waited, because I knew that in about an hour, all of this careful image management was going to come crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. But for now, let her have her moment. Let her bask in the admiration and the congratulations and the general sense that she'd achieved everything she'd worked for. The reckoning could wait until cocktail hour. Cocktail hour at the Lakeshore Conservatory was like watching a carefully choreographed ballet performed by people who'd all had just enough champagne to think they were better dancers than they actually were. The string quartet, for classical musicians who probably made more per hour than most people's daily wages, had set up in the corner and were working their way through what I recognized as a playlist designed to sound sophisticated without being so highbrow that it made the tech bros uncomfortable. The bar was doing steady business, serving drinks with names like Eternal Bliss and Love's First Kiss to guests who were clearly more interested in the alcohol content than the romantic branding. I'd grabbed a bourbon, just bourbon, no cutesy wedding name required, and positioned myself near the west wall where I had a clear view of the entire room and easy access to both exits. Old habits from my consulting days, when reading a room could mean the difference between closing a deal and watching it walk out the door. Tessa was making the rounds, doing that thing wives do at family events where they somehow manage to talk to everyone, remember everyone's kids' names, and keep an eye on their potentially volatile husband all at the same time. Every few minutes, she'd catch my eye across the room and give me a little smile that said both, "behaving yourself," and "I love you even when you're plotting someone's professional downfall." The Luminate Ventures crowd had naturally gravitated toward each other, forming the kind of insular professional cluster that happens whenever people who work together find themselves at social events. Adrian was holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the lake, nursing what looked like scotch and listening to Kyle Duran explain something with the kind of animated hand gestures that suggested either passion or panic. Elena Park was working the room like the seasoned board member she was, making strategic conversation with other guests while keeping one eye on the Luminate team dynamics. Priya Menon had found herself talking to Margaret about something that involved a lot of nodding and polite laughter, while Miravas was examining the conservatory's architecture with the analytical intensity of someone who couldn't turn off the strategic planning part of her brain, even at a wedding. It was perfect. They were all here, all relaxed, all in party mode, and completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. I was working on my second bourbon and contemplating the irony of the situation when I saw Bianca making her way across the room toward Adrian with the determined stride of someone on a mission. She'd changed from her ceremony dress into something more cocktail appropriate. A flowing number that probably cost more than most people's rent, but somehow managed to look effortless rather than expensive. Her face was flushed with champagne, excitement, and what I recognized as the particular kind of confidence that comes from being the center of attention at your own wedding. She was riding high on compliments, congratulations, and the general feeling that this was her day and everything was going exactly according to plan. Which, technically it was. Just not her plan. "Adrian," she called out as she approached, her voice carrying that bright, slightly too loud quality that people get when they've had just enough alcohol to amplify their natural personality traits. "I've been wanting to introduce you to someone." The string quartet hit a particularly melodic passage just as she reached Adrian's little conversational cluster, and I watched several other guests turn to see what was happening. Perfect timing, really. Couldn't have choreographed it better if I'd tried. Adrian turned toward her with that polite attention that successful executives give to social interactions they can't avoid but aren't particularly invested in. "Of course, Bianca. Congratulations again on a beautiful ceremony." "Thank you." She practically beamed at the compliment. "But I wanted you to meet my family, specifically my brother-in-law." She gestured toward me with the kind of theatrical flourish that would have been at home on a game show. "Adrian, meet Marcus, the unemployed loser I was telling you about." And there it was. The moment I'd been waiting for since last night's dinner, delivered with even more public spectacle than I'd dared to hope for. The string quartet seemed to miss a note, or maybe that was just my imagination. Several nearby conversations stuttered to a halt as people processed what they'd just heard. The phrase "unemployed loser" hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring car, impossible to ignore and deeply uncomfortable for everyone within earshot. Carl Durant's animated hand gestures froze mid-motion. Priya looked up from her conversation with Margaret with the sharp attention of someone whose HR instincts had just started screaming warnings. Elena Park's eyebrows rose approximately half an inch, which in boardroom terms was equivalent to standing up and shouting, "What the hell?" But Adrian just looked at me with that calm, unreadable expression that had probably made more than a few startup founders break out in cold sweats over the years. He studied my face for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, his eyes moving from my carefully chosen suit to my perfectly knotted tie to the platinum tie bar that caught the conservatory's abundant natural light. Then, slowly, his expression changed. The polite mask slipped away, replaced by something that might have been recognition, might have been surprise, and was definitely amusement. A smile started at the corners of his mouth and spread across his face like sunrise breaking over the horizon. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, loud enough for the growing circle of suddenly attentive guests to hear clearly. He stepped forward and clapped a hand on my shoulder with the kind of genuine warmth reserved for old friends and respected colleagues. "Marcus Hale, how the hell are you?" The atmosphere in our little corner of the conservatory shifted like a weather front moving through. I could practically feel the confusion rippling outward as people tried to reconcile the warm recognition in Adrian's voice with Bianca's introduction of me as an unemployed loser. Bianca's triumphant expression flickered like a candle in a sudden breeze. "You know each other?" "Know each other?" Adrian's laugh had the kind of genuine warmth that you can't fake, no matter how good your poker face is. "Bianca, I don't think you understand." He turned back to me, still smiling. "How long has it been?" 2 years since we had coffee." "About that," I said, keeping my voice casual despite the fact that my heart was beating like a drum solo. "Good to see you, Adrian." The circle of observers was growing as other guests sensed drama unfolding and drifted over with the kind of casual curiosity that makes wedding receptions infinitely more entertaining than the organizers usually intend. Margaret had abandoned her conversation with Priya and was moving closer with the expression of someone who suspected she was about to witness either a miracle or a disaster. Bianca looked like someone who'd just realized she'd walked into the wrong movie halfway through the plot. "I don't understand," she said, her voice carrying a note of rising panic that probably wasn't audible to anyone who didn't know her as well as I did. "Marcus doesn't. He's not." "Not what?" Adrian asked, and there was something in his tone that made it very clear this wasn't a rhetorical question. The moment stretched out like taffy, sweet and potentially messy, while Bianca's champagne-fueled confidence began its rapid descent into stone-cold sobriety. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to explain calling someone an unemployed loser to their face when that someone was apparently on friendly terms with her boss. "He doesn't work," she said finally, the words coming out smaller and less certain than before. "I mean, he doesn't have a job. Tessa supports him." The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that makes everyone hyper-aware of background noise. I could hear the string quartet, the clink of glasses, the murmur of other conversations, and somewhere in the distance, what sounded like a lawn mower that someone had forgotten to turn off. Adrian looked at Bianca for a long moment, then back at me, then at the growing crowd of suddenly very interested wedding guests. Elena Park had moved closer, her board member instincts clearly activated by whatever was happening here. Priya looked like she was mentally composing incident reports. Kyle had the expression of someone watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. And then Adrian smiled again, but this time it wasn't warm. This time it was the kind of smile that corporate executives give right before they explain why your department is being eliminated. "Bianca," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive crowd, "you're fired." The words landed like a meteor hitting the conservatory floor. Several guests made small, involuntary sounds of surprise. Someone's champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers and shattered against the stone floor with a crystalline crash that seemed to echo for far longer than physics should have allowed. Bianca's face went through what had to be 5 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, panic, anger, and finally a kind of desperate hope that this was all some kind of elaborate joke that would make sense if she just waited long enough. "What?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. This is a joke, right? It's my wedding day." "No," Adrian said, his voice steady and completely without humor. "It's not." And that's when the real show began. The silence that followed Adrian's declaration lasted exactly long enough for everyone within earshot to process what they'd just witnessed. Then, like a dam bursting, the quiet shattered into a cacophony of whispered conversations, sharp intakes of breath, and the kind of nervous energy that fills a room when something dramatic happens and nobody's quite sure how they're supposed to react. I stayed perfectly still, watching Bianca's face cycle through what had to be the 5 stages of career grief and fast forward. Denial was already giving way to anger, and I could practically see the moment when her brain shifted from "this can't be happening" to "someone's going to pay for this." "You can't be serious," she said, her voice gaining strength and volume as the shock wore off. "Adrian, this is my wedding day. There are 100 people here. This is..." She gestured wildly at the conservatory, the guests, the string quartet that had stopped playing entirely and was now pretending to tune their instruments while obviously listening to every word. "This is insane." Adrian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When you've spent years making decisions that affect people's lives and livelihoods, you develop a particular kind of calm authority that makes shouting unnecessary and usually counterproductive. "No, Bianca," he said, each word clear and measured. "What's insane is mocking a family member at his own dinner table. What's insane is using someone's perceived status as entertainment for your colleagues. What's insane is thinking that cruelty is acceptable as long as you're punching down instead of up." The crowd around us had grown considerably. What had started as maybe a dozen curious onlookers was now closer to 30 people, including most of the Luminate Ventures team and a good chunk of the wedding party. Margaret was pushing through the cluster of guests with the determined expression of a mother hen whose chicks were under attack. Clive followed behind her, looking like a man who'd suddenly realized his peaceful retirement was about to be interrupted by family drama of epic proportions. "But he doesn't work." Bianca's voice was climbing toward hysteria, and I could see several guests exchanging uncomfortable glances. "He sits at home all day while Tessa pays the bills." I was just being honest. That's when Elena Park stepped forward, and I had to admire the way she moved through the crowd like a shark cutting through water. Board members don't get to where they are by avoiding difficult conversations, and Elena had the kind of presence that made even venture capitalists stand a little straighter. "Honest about what, exactly?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the kind of polite interest that experienced executives use when they're about to dismantle someone's argument piece by piece. "What do you actually know about Marcus's professional situation?" Bianca looked at Elena like she'd just been asked to solve calculus in her head while juggling flaming torches. He doesn't have a job. Everyone knows that. He's been unemployed for years. Everyone knows that, Elena repeated, and somehow managed to make it sound like the most ridiculous statement anyone had ever uttered. She glanced at Adrian, then at me, then back at Bianca. Based on what information? Based on the fact that he doesn't go to an office. Bianca's composure was completely gone now, replaced by the kind of desperate defensiveness that people exhibit when they realize they've stepped in something much deeper than they originally thought. He stays home. H.E. Gardens. He doesn't talk about work because he doesn't have any. Priya Menon had materialized at Elena's shoulder with the silent efficiency of someone whose job involved cleaning up workplace disasters before they became lawsuits. She was holding what looked like her phone, but I suspected she was recording this conversation for future reference. HR directors don't survive long in competitive industries without developing excellent documentation habits. So your assessment of someone's professional worth, Priya said in the kind of carefully neutral tone they probably teach in graduate programs for human resources, is based entirely on whether they commute to a traditional office environment. That's not. Bianca started, then stopped, apparently realizing that she was digging herself deeper with every word. Look, this is ridiculous. Adrian, you know I'm a good employee. I bring in clients. I close deals. I work 80-hour weeks. You can't fire me because of some family drama. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that made it clear he was about to deliver what corporate America calls a teachable moment. You're right about one thing, he said. You do work hard. You are smart. You have closed deals and brought in clients. He paused, and in that pause, I could practically hear Bianca's hopes rising. But respect isn't optional at Luminate Ventures. It's not something you get to turn off when you're with family, or when you think someone can affect your career, or when you've had a few drinks and want to impress your colleagues. Kyle Durant had moved closer during this exchange, and I could see him taking mental notes with the focus of someone who understood that this conversation was going to become company legend within about 24 hours. Investor relations professionals live for moments like this, not because they enjoy watching people get fired, but because they understand that how a company handles difficult situations reveals everything about its actual values versus its marketing copy. When you introduced Marcus as an unemployed loser, Adrian continued, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent crowd, you weren't just being cruel to a family member. You were demonstrating exactly how you treat people when you think they have no power to affect your life. Margaret had finally reached the inner circle of this corporate soap opera, and she looked like a woman prepared to go to war for her daughter. Now, just wait 1 minute, she said, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that had probably ended thousands of childhood arguments with nothing more than tone. Bianca made a mistake, but firing her at her own wedding is completely inappropriate. Mrs. Ortiz, Elena said, turning toward Margaret with the kind of respectful attention that board members give to important stakeholders. I understand this is difficult. But your daughter didn't just make a casual comment. She used someone's perceived professional failure as entertainment for her colleagues at a family event in front of multiple Luminate partners. And Priya added with the precision of someone reading from an invisible HR manual. She did so while representing herself as a Luminate employee to clients and industry contacts who were present at the dinner. I could see Bianca starting to understand the scope of what she'd stepped in. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or family drama. This was about professional judgment, workplace culture, and the kind of behavior that venture capital firms absolutely cannot afford to have associated with their brand. But Marcus isn't even. She started, then stopped as she finally, began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she didn't actually know what she thought she knew. That's when Adrian delivered the kill shot. Marcus Hale, he said, looking directly at Bianca, but speaking loudly enough for everyone in our corner of the conservatory to hear clearly, wrote the bridge financing that kept Luminate Ventures alive when our runway was 6 weeks and every other investor in Chicago thought we were too risky to touch. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, a caterer dropped what sounded like an entire tray of glassware, but even that seemed muffled compared to the ringing quiet around our little group. He backed this firm when no one else would. Adrian continued, his voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. When we were three guys in a converted warehouse space, living on ramen noodles and venture capital dreams, Marcus wrote a check that let us survive long enough to prove our concept. He asked for nothing public, no press releases, no board seat, no ego stroking, just equity and faith. Bianca's face had gone through several color changes during this speech, finally settling on a shade of pale that matched her wedding dress. That's not, he never said. Why would he? Elena asked, and there was something approaching pity in her voice. Why would anyone advertise their investment portfolio to family members who clearly measure human worth by job titles and office addresses? The crowd had grown to include most of the wedding guests now, drawn by the kind of magnetic pull that public drama exerts on even the most polite observers. I spotted Tessa near the edge of the cluster, her face a mixture of pride, concern, and what might have been relief that this particular family secret was finally out in the open. Every deal you've closed, Adrian said, his words falling like stones into still water. Every client you've brought in, every commission you've earned, it was all built on the foundation that Marcus provided when this company was nothing but an idea and a prayer. He paused, letting that sink in, then delivered the final blow. You sold deals with his trust fund behind you, Bianca. You built your career on his investment. And then you called him a loser to impress me. Adrian's smile was cold enough to freeze champagne. That level of professional and personal judgment disqualifies you from representing this firm in any capacity. The word trust seemed to echo in the conservatory's glass cathedral, bouncing off the walls and settling into the silence like sediment in still water. I watched as the implications of what she'd just learned hit Bianca in waves. The realization that she'd been wrong, that she'd been cruel, and that her cruelty had just cost her everything she'd worked for. It was, I had to admit, even more satisfying than I'd hoped it would be. The aftermath of a professional execution carried out in public is a lot like watching a building collapse in slow motion. First comes the initial shock, then the ripple effects, then the desperate scramble as everyone tries to figure out where they stand in the new reality that's just been created out of the wreckage of the old one. The conservatory had split into distinct clusters of people, each group processing what they'd just witnessed according to their own particular relationship to the drama. The Luminate Ventures team had formed a tight professional huddle near the windows, conducting what looked like an emergency board meeting disguised as casual wedding conversation. Other guests were doing that thing people do at social events when something uncomfortable happens. They were pretending to be fascinated by the floral arrangements while obviously listening to every word being spoken within a 50-foot radius. And right in the middle of it all stood Bianca, looking like someone who'd just been hit by a freight train that she never saw coming. Margaret was the first to recover from the shock, maternal instincts kicking in with the force of a protective lioness who'd just watched someone take a shot at her cub. She stepped forward with the kind of righteous indignation that only mothers can properly summon, her evening bag clutched in her hands like a weapon she was prepared to use if negotiations failed. "This is absolutely outrageous," she announced, her voice carrying across the conservatory with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years managing PDA meetings and charity fundraisers. "I don't care what kind of business relationship you people think you have, but firing someone at their own wedding is completely inappropriate and probably illegal." Priya Menon turned toward Margaret with the patient expression of someone who'd spent years explaining employment law to people who were too angry to listen carefully. "Mrs. Ortiz, I understand you're upset, but Illinois is an at-will employment state. Luminate Ventures has the right to terminate any employee at any time for any lawful reason. But not like this." Margaret's voice was climbing toward the register she'd probably used when Bianca and Tessa were teenagers and had broken curfew. Not in public, not at a family event, not without proper notice. Elena Park stepped forward with the kind of diplomatic calm that board members develop after years of managing difficult conversations between difficult people. "Actually, the public nature of this situation is precisely why it needed to be addressed immediately. Your daughter made her comments about Marcus in front of multiple Luminate partners, clients, and industry contacts. Allowing her to continue representing the firm after demonstrating such poor judgment would have been professionally irresponsible." Clive had been standing quietly throughout this exchange, But now he moved closer to his wife with the expression of a man who'd suddenly realized that his peaceful Saturday evening had turned into a corporate legal drama. "Margaret," he said quietly, "maybe we should hear them out." "Hear them out." Margaret turned on her husband with the kind of look that had probably ended more than a few marital disagreements over the years. "Clive, they just humiliated our daughter in front of 100 people. At her own wedding." That's when Bianca finally found her voice again, though it came out smaller and more uncertain than anyone had probably ever heard from her before. "Mom, please," she said, her hand reaching out to touch Margaret's arm. "Just, please stop." The simple request seemed to deflate some of Margaret's maternal fury, though her protective instincts were still clearly running at full throttle. "Honey, you don't have to accept this. We can get lawyers. We can fight this." "With what grounds?" Bianca asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was finally beginning to understand the full scope of what had just happened. "Mom, they're right. I screwed up. I screwed up badly." Jordan had been standing off to the side during this entire exchange, looking like a man who'd signed up for a wedding and accidentally found himself in the middle of a corporate thriller. He moved closer to his new wife with the kind of awkward protectiveness that people show when they want to help, but have absolutely no idea what kind of help would actually be useful. "Bianca," he said softly, "we can figure this out. It's just a job. There are other jobs." The look she gave him was the kind of expression that probably appeared on the Titanic when someone suggested that the iceberg was just a minor navigation issue. "Jordan, you don't understand. This isn't just any job. This is my career. This is everything I've worked for since college." And that's when I decided it was time to do what I'd come here to do. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope that Jonathan Pierce had prepared for me that morning. The certified check inside represented more money than most people saw in a year, and under normal circumstances, it would have been a generous and thoughtful wedding gift from a brother-in-law who wanted to celebrate the happy couple's new life together. These weren't normal circumstances, but that didn't change what the check represented. "Bianca," I said, stepping forward and extending the envelope toward her. "This was always going to be your wedding gift. It still is." She stared at the envelope like it might explode if she touched it, her expression cycling between confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. "I don't understand." "Open it," I said simply, with hands that shook slightly, whether from champagne, shock, or the emotional whiplash of the last 10 minutes. She opened the envelope and pulled out the check. I watched her eyes scan the amount, then widen as the number registered fully. $35,000, she whispered, looking up at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It was confusion and gratitude and shame and anger all mixed together in a cocktail that probably didn't have a name. "Why would you, after what I said, after what just happened?" "Because weddings deserve clean starts," I said, loud enough for the crowd of observers to hear clearly. "And because I was family yesterday, I'm family today, and I'll be family tomorrow." The money isn't contingent on your job, your apologies, or your opinion of me. Jordan was staring at the check over his wife's shoulder, his expression suggesting that $35,000 represented more financial security than he'd ever expected to see in one place at one time. "Marcus, we can't accept this. Not after." "Yes, you can," I said firmly. "This gift isn't about what happened at dinner last night, and it's not about what happened here tonight. It's about the fact that you two are starting a life together, and new lives deserve support from family, even when family members sometimes say stupid things to each other." Tessa had worked her way through the crowd during this exchange, and now she appeared at my side with the kind of timing that only comes from 12 years of marriage and an almost supernatural ability to know when your spouse needs backup. "The check was Marcus's idea," she said, addressing both Bianca and the crowd of witnesses who were still hanging on every word of this family drama. "He ordered it yesterday morning, before the rehearsal dinner, before anything that happened last night." The implications of that timeline seemed to hit Bianca like a physical blow. She'd called me a loser at dinner, not knowing that I'd already planned to give her and Jordan enough money to pay off student loans, make a down payment on a house, or start the kind of emergency fund that most young couples only dream about. "I don't deserve this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not," I agreed, which probably wasn't the most diplomatic response, but was certainly the most honest one. "But Jordan does. And more importantly, This isn't about what anyone deserves. It's about what family does for family, even when family screws up. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet, less shocked, more contemplative. I could see people processing not just what had happened, but what it meant about forgiveness, family, and the difference between consequences and cruelty. The money isn't the lesson, Bianca, I said finally. The lesson is that actions have consequences, but family is family. You lost your job tonight because of the choices you made. You're getting this gift because of the choices I made. Two different things, based on two different sets of values. She nodded slowly, tears starting to track down her cheeks in lines that were probably going to play hell with her wedding makeup. I'm sorry, she whispered. Marcus, I'm so sorry. I know, I said. And I did know. The apology wasn't going to undo the damage, but it was a start. The thing about watching someone's entire professional world collapse in real time is that eventually, the shock wears off and you're left with the practical question of what happens next. Bianca was standing there holding a $35,000 check and the smoking ruins of her career, while a conservatory full of wedding guests tried to figure out whether they should pretend this whole thing never happened or start taking notes for the stories they'd be telling at dinner parties for the next 5 years. That's when Priya Menon stepped forward with the kind of professional composure that reminded everyone why HR directors get paid the big bucks to clean up messes that other people create. Bianca, she said, her voice carrying the neutral tone that human resources professionals perfect somewhere around their second week on the job. Obviously, this situation is unprecedented, and we need to handle the transition in a way that's fair to everyone involved. Translation. We're going to fire you professionally instead of just dramatically, because we're a real company and not a reality TV show. Bianca looked up from the check she'd been staring at like it might contain the answers to life's deepest mysteries. What does that mean exactly? Priya pulled out her phone with the efficiency of someone who'd probably handled more termination procedures than most people had hot dinners. It means we're going to structure your exit properly, even though the circumstances are unusual. Paid leave through the end of the month, health coverage continuation for 60 days, and a reference letter that focuses on your professional achievements rather than today's incident. The relief that crossed Bianca's face was so obvious you could have seen it from the parking lot. Whatever else had happened tonight, she wasn't going to be left completely high and dry with no income and no benefits while she tried to figure out how to rebuild her career from scratch. However, Priya continued, and that single word carried enough weight to crush a small building. If you're interested in potential future opportunities with Luminate Ventures, there would be conditions. Now that was interesting. I watched Adrian's face carefully, trying to read whether this was Priya freelancing or whether they discussed this possibility during their impromptu huddle by the windows. Adrian's expression gave away exactly nothing, which probably meant he'd known this was coming. What kind of conditions? Bianca asked, her voice carrying a note of hope that was probably premature but understandable under the circumstances. Elena Park moved closer, and I realized that this wasn't just an HR conversation anymore. This was a board-level decision being made in real time at a wedding reception, which, when you thought about it, was either completely insane or exactly the kind of agile decision-making that separated successful companies from bureaucratic disasters. 6 months minimum before any reapplication consideration, Elena said, ticking off points with the precision of someone reading from an invisible checklist. Completion of professional development coaching focused on leadership, empathy, and unconscious bias. Documentation of 40 hours of volunteer work with workforce development or career transition nonprofit organizations. And Priya added with the kind of emphasis that suggested this was the most important condition of all. Absolutely no social media documentation of the volunteer work. No LinkedIn posts about your personal growth journey. No Instagram stories about giving back to the community. No Twitter threads about lessons learned. The work has to be genuine service, not reputation management. I had to hand it to them. They just outlined a rehabilitation program that would either help Bianca become a better human being or prove definitively that she was more interested in appearances than actual growth. It was elegant, fair, and completely ruthless in its effectiveness. Bianca was nodding frantically, like a drowning person who'd just been thrown a life preserver. Yes, absolutely. I can do all of that. I want to do all of that. But then she stopped nodding and looked directly at me for the first time since this whole conversation had started. Marcus, she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. What do you think? Do you think I deserve a second chance? And there it was, the question I'd been hoping she'd ask, because it meant she was finally understanding that this wasn't just about her relationship with her employer. This was about her relationship with basic human decency, and more specifically, her relationship with me. I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus the kind of performative regret that people exhibit when they're caught rather than when they're actually sorry. What I saw was exhaustion, embarrassment, and something that might have been the beginning of real self-awareness. I think, I said carefully, that you've spent a lot of years confusing success with worth and titles with character. Last night at dinner, you didn't see a person when you looked at me. You saw a label, unemployed, and you decided that label told you everything you needed to know about my value as a human being. She winced, but she didn't look away, which was progress. The question isn't whether you deserve a second chance, I continued. The question is whether you want to become the kind of person who sees people instead of resumes. Because if you do this program, if you put in the work, if you actually volunteer 40 hours helping people find jobs without posting about it on social media, you might learn something important about what really matters. I paused, aware that the entire conservatory had gone silent again and that my next words were going to be remembered by everyone who heard them. You don't have to like me, Bianca. You don't have to think I'm successful or impressive or worthy of your respect. But you do have to stop ranking human beings by their job titles, their income levels, or their LinkedIn profiles. If you want back into professional rooms, you need to come as a human being first and an employee second. Tears were streaming down her face now, destroying what was left of her wedding makeup and probably staining her dress. But she didn't seem to care about either of those things anymore. I didn't see you, she whispered. I didn't see you at all. No, I agreed. You didn't. Adrian stepped forward, and I could see him making the kind of executive decision that would either look brilliant or insane, depending on how things played out over the next 6 months. The eligibility stands, he said, looking at Elena and Priya for confirmation before turning back to Bianca. 6 months, coaching, volunteer work, no social media documentation. If you complete all of that successfully, we'll consider a conversation about future opportunities. But understand, Elena added, her board member authority making it clear this wasn't negotiable. This is a one-time offer. If you reapply and we determine that you haven't genuinely grown from this experience, there won't be a third chance. Bianca nodded so hard I was worried she might give herself whiplash. I understand. Thank you. All of you. I know I don't deserve this, but I won't waste it. Jordan moved closer to his wife, finally finding his place in this corporate drama that had hijacked their wedding reception. We both appreciate this, he said, his voice carrying the kind of gratitude that comes from watching disaster transform into unexpected opportunity. Whatever Bianca needs to do to learn from this, we'll make it happen. Tessa squeezed my hand, and I could feel some of the tension that had been building since last night's dinner finally starting to dissipate. This wasn't the ending I'd planned, but it was better than the ending I'd expected. Sometimes mercy looks like consequences. Sometimes second chances come with conditions. And sometimes the best way to teach someone about respect is to show them what it looks like when it's offered freely, even when it hasn't been earned. 3 months later, I was back in my garden, tending to the fall tomatoes and thinking about how strange it is that some of life's most important lessons get learned in the most unexpected classrooms. The Cherokee purples had turned out better than I'd hoped, and I was picking the last of the season's harvest when Tessa came out with her laptop and a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool September air. Interesting email from Priya, she said, settling onto our garage sale bench with the kind of casual tone that meant she had news she was trying not to make a big deal about. I set down my basket of tomatoes and gave her my full attention. Over the past few months, we'd gotten periodic updates about Bianca's progress through what Tessa had started calling her rehabilitation tour. But this was the first time anyone from Luminate had reached out directly. Good interesting or train wreck interesting? I asked. See for yourself, she said, turning the laptop screen toward me. The email was short, professional, and surprisingly warm for something that came from an HR director. Marcus and Tessa, asterisk, thought you'd want to know that Bianca completed her volunteer hours at Harbor Mission last week. The program director, Carmen Rodriguez, called to say they've never had a volunteer work as hard or with as much genuine commitment to helping clients succeed. Bianca has been running resume workshops, mock interview sessions, and job search strategy groups. Carmen said several clients specifically requested to continue working with her even after her 40 hours were complete. Asterisk. Her coaching sessions with Dr. Patricia Wells are also going well. Patricia reports significant progress in recognizing and addressing unconscious bias, though she notes that Bianca still has work to do on distinguishing between confidence and arrogance. Asterisk. No social media posts, no public relations efforts, no attempts to turn this experience into personal branding content. Just work, asterisk. Thought you should know, asterisk. Best regards, asterisk. Priya asterisk. I read it twice, then handed the laptop back to Tessa. Huh indeed, she said, closing the laptop and sipping her coffee. She called me last week, you know? Bianca did. That was news to me. Tessa and her sister had been texting occasionally, brief, careful exchanges that focused on logistics rather than emotions, but they hadn't actually talked since the wedding. What did she say? She apologized. Really apologized. Not the kind of sorry you say when you want something to go away, but the kind you say when you've actually figured out what you did wrong. Tessa pulled her legs up onto the bench, getting comfortable for what was clearly going to be a longer conversation. She told me about working with people at Harbor Mission who've been out of work for months or years, not by choice, but by circumstance. Said it was the first time she'd really understood the difference between being unemployed and being a failure. I picked up my tomato basket and sat down next to her. And she said she'd spent 3 hours last Tuesday helping a guy named Frank who'd been laid off from the steel mill 2 years ago and couldn't figure out how to translate his skills into something that made sense to 20-something HR managers who'd never worked with their hands. Tessa smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she was proud of her sister despite everything that had happened. She said Frank reminded her of you, except he didn't have the luxury of keeping his situation private. That hit me harder than I'd expected. The idea that Bianca had spent time with someone who was genuinely struggling, not because of poor choices or bad judgment, but because of economic forces beyond his control, and had connected that experience to her treatment of me. Well, that suggested a level of self-awareness that I honestly hadn't been sure she was capable of developing. Did she ask about the Luminate thing? I asked. Nope. Didn't mention work. Didn't ask about Adrian. Didn't even hint that she was hoping for anything other than forgiveness from family. Tessa leaned against my shoulder. She asked if you'd be willing to have coffee with her sometime. No agenda, no asks, just a conversation between family members who are trying to figure out how to be family again. I thought about that while I watched a neighbor's cat stalk something invisible in the bushes. 3 months ago, Bianca had been someone who measured human worth by professional achievement and used other people's perceived failures as entertainment for her colleagues. The idea that she might actually be learning to see people as individuals rather than resume line items was encouraging. What did you tell her? I told her to ask you herself. Of course she did. Tessa had always been better at forcing people to have conversations they needed to have rather than conversations they wanted to have. That afternoon, my phone rang. Bianca's name on the caller ID, which would have been unthinkable 6 months ago for entirely different reasons than it was surprising now. Marcus. Her voice was different, smaller, less certain, but somehow more genuine than I remembered it being in years. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Sure, I said, settling into my study chair and looking at the wall where my Luminate documents still hung like trophies from a war that had ended with unexpected victory for everyone involved. I wanted to apologize, she said without preamble. Really apologize, not just say sorry because people expect me to. I spent the last 3 months learning about what it's like when people judge you by circumstances instead of character, and I finally understand what I did to you. I waited, because apologies work better when people are allowed to finish them completely. I called you unemployed like it was a moral failing instead of a choice, she continued. I used your situation as entertainment because I thought it made me look successful by comparison. I was cruel because I thought cruelty towards someone I perceived as weak would impress people I wanted to think I was strong. Yeah, I said. That's exactly what you did. I know. And I know that saying sorry doesn't undo it. especially not when I said it in front of your colleagues and my boss and basically everyone who matters to both of us professionally." She paused, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. "But I wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what respect actually means and why it matters and how badly I failed at it." "Bianca," I said, and something in my tone made her go quiet. "The apology means something. It doesn't fix everything, but it means something." "Does it mean enough for coffee sometime?" she asked. "Just family coffee. No agenda, no asks, no attempts to talk about work or second chances or any of that. Just two people who are related by marriage trying to figure out how to be in the same room without anyone getting fired." I laughed, which probably surprised both of us. "Yeah, I think we can manage coffee." 3 weeks later, I met Bianca at a small cafe near Harbor Mission, where she'd been continuing her volunteer work even after completing her required hours. She looked different, less polished, more comfortable, like someone who'd stopped worrying quite so much about impressing strangers. We talked for 2 hours about everything except work. She told me about Frank, the laid-off steel worker who'd landed a job as a manufacturing coordinator after she'd helped him reframe his experience in language that tech companies could understand. I told her about my tomatoes, my investment philosophy, and why I'd never wanted the kind of public profile that most venture capital partners seem to crave. When she left, she hugged me goodbye, not the obligatory family event hug, but the kind that suggests you actually like the person you're hugging. 2 months after that, Adrian called to tell me that Bianca had reapplied to Luminate Ventures. Her coaching was complete, her volunteer work had expanded into a regular commitment, and Dr. Wells had written a recommendation that suggested genuine personal growth rather than performative rehabilitation. "What do you think?" he asked. I said, looking out at my winter garden where next year's possibilities were sleeping under the soil, "that people can change if they want it badly enough. And I think Bianca wants to. She got the job. Different role, smaller territory, but a real second chance based on real growth." And at Sunday dinner last week, she sat across from me and said, "I didn't see people before. I saw ladders." "Ladders are fine for roofs," I told her, "just not for hearts." She laughed, then cried, then thanked Tessa for standing between us until we could stand together. At Luminate, Adrian and I shared coffee in the quiet glass conference room where we'd first shaken hands 6 years ago. "You didn't have to step in at the wedding," he said. "You didn't have to say it out loud," I replied. We both smiled. Respect, it turns out, isn't just theory. It's policy, it's practice, and in our family, it's now a rule. Never call someone a loser when you've never bothered to ask them who they really are. And if you forget, well, there's enough light in this house to remind you.